Major sevens, sevens. What's the difference? Which is which? I made a video recently attempting to explain chord numbers. And in that video, I kind of skimmed over something about 7 chords because I kind of expected that most people were on top of that understanding. But I was surprised to see in the comments that a lot of people are quite unclear about that. So here we are, a video all about 7 chords. You're welcome. I started trying to play jazz music when I was 17 or 18. I'm still trying, by the way. Now, in jazz music, it's pretty much a prerequisite that every chord you play, you add a 7 to, pretty much. So when you delve into that world, you have to have a good understanding of your 7s. Prior to playing jazz, I was mostly just playing pop rock singer-songwriter stuff, where the occurrence of a 7 chord is much rarer. So maybe you're in a similar boat where that sight of a 7 at the end of your chord symbol brings you out in a cold sweat. Is that a B natural or B flat? Now, this is something that you really don't want to mix up or get wrong, because it will fundamentally change the character and function of your chord. So, hopefully, for those of you who have some hazy knowledge on this, I'm going to try and clear it up. Now, I think the simplest and most concise way to think about 7 chords is this. Adding a major 7 to our chord, we simply add a note that's a semitone down or a half step down from our root note. And a 7 chord, a chord that we add just a 7 to, we simply add a note a whole step down or 2 semitones. Now that's essentially it, but let's open it up a little bit. Let's start by looking at creating chords within a major key context. Now we can build chords on every degree of the scale using only scale notes. We do that by adding notes in intervals of thirds. Or essentially what we do is we skip a note each time in the scale. So we have our root note, then we miss the next scale note, add that one, miss the next scale note. And once we've added our 2 notes to every root note, we've got all the fundamental triads that exist from each note of this scale. And the scale degrees that we have in each chord are the root, not the second, the third, not the fourth, the fifth, the root, third, and the fifth. And for every scale note, we have the same thing, root, third, fifth, root, third, fifth. Now we have names for each chord within our major key, although they're probably more commonly referred to by their number, but we do have these names too. And I'll come back to these in a bit. So each chord has a root, a third, and a fifth, but we're talking about sevenths, so we don't want to stop at our fifths. We continue to extend our chords, following in the same fashion we did before to build these. We add a note in an interval of third, or skipping a note in the scale. So we can add now our root, third, fifth, seventh to our chord tones. We could do that for every chord tone. So we can create all of the 7th chords that exist within the major scale. Now, if you remember back to when we had just 3-note triad chords, that created 3 different chord types within our major scale. We had major chords, we had minor chords, and then at the end we had that diminished chord. Now, once we added our 7th to those chords, we suddenly had 4 different chord types. We had major 7ths, we had minor 7ths, we had the 7th, and we had a minor 7 flat 5, or also known as a half diminished chord. So initially we have 3 major chords that all seem to be the same on the 1st, the 4th, and the 5th degree of the scale. But once we added that 7th to it, they were no longer all the same. The 1st and the 4th became major 7ths, but the 5th became a 7, G7. Let's have a look at why. So on our 1 chord, the 7th degree of the scale, using only scale notes from C major, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is a B natural. That B is just a semitone down from the root note. And this chord contains the intervals of a major 3rd, a perfect 5th, and a major 7th. Let's do the same with our 4 chord. Starting on the root note, the 7th degree of the scale, just using scale tones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is an E natural. E is just a semitone away from the root note, and this chord contains the intervals of a major third, a perfect fifth, and a major seventh. And these are called major 7 chords because of that interval of a major seventh. In the same way that that interval is a major third, this is a major 7. So that's major 7 chords, all you need to know. Well, one more thing. There's multiple different ways that you might see major 7 chords written. There's the way that I've been using here, which I think is probably the most common, which is the chord letter followed by MAJ and then 7. And then maybe the next most common is the triangle, or triangle with a 7. They both mean the same thing. Now there's this one way of writing it, which is an uppercase M and then a 7. Can we all agree to not use that? It's not very common, but I think it's dangerous. It's very similar to a minor 7 symbol, which, especially when it's handwritten, and they are very different chords, and we don't want to be making mistakes between major 7s and minor 7 chords. So we're all in agreement? No more chord symbols like this? Great. Good job, guys. But Michael, wouldn't it make more sense to just call this a C7 chord, because all we've done is add 7th degree of the scale to our chord? Well, you'd think that, wouldn't you? But that's not the case. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about this. But first, we need to look at our 5 chord. We looked at our 1 chord and our 4 chord, the major 7s. But we haven't looked at our 5 chord. So let's have a look and see why that one's different. And then I'll come back and talk about the name and stuff. Okay, back to our G chord then, the 5th chord within our major key. And we're going to add our 7. So the 7th degree from this, starting from our root note, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is an F major. Now, an F major isn't a semitone down from the root note. It's 2 semitones down from the root note. And it creates the intervals of a major third, a perfect fifth, and a flat 7. Now, this would be a major 7, the F sharp. So this is a flat 7 or a minor 7 interval. So there's the difference between our major 7 chords and our 7 chords. Our 7th is 2 semitones or a whole step down from our root note, and has an interval of a flat 7 or a minor 7 between the root and the 7th. So obviously this chord has a different makeup than the other 2 chords, the 2 major 7 chords. So we need to call this something different. Now, when we add a flat 7 or a minor 7 to a chord, all we do is simply add the number 7 at the end of the chord. So this would become a G7. So every major key has 2 major 7 chords, but only 1 7 chord. Now, if you think back to the names that we gave the chords in the major key, you'll see that the only 7 chord is on the 5th degree of the scale and is called the dominant chord. So you'll often hear a 7 chord referred to as a dominant chord. Also, with this being the case, you'll often hear a 7 chord being referred to as a 5 chord because it's always the 5th degree of the major scale. So dominant chord, 7 chord, dominant 7, 5 chord, they all mean the same thing. Now, up to now, I've only talked about adding 7ths to major chords, but we can add both major 7s and flat 7s to minor chords too. Now, if we look back at the 7th chords that we created in our major key, the 3 minor chords we've added 7ths to, all of those have added flat 7ths. So D minor, we've added a C, which is 2 semitones or a whole step down from the root, which is a flat 7, interval of a flat 7. So we've got D minor with a flat 7. E minor, we add our D, which is 2 semitones down, a whole step down from our root note, which is another flat 7. A minor, we've added a G, which is 2 semitones, a whole step down from the root note. So, as I mentioned before, when we're just adding a flat 7, all we simply do to the chord symbol is add a 7 next to it. So we get D minor 7, we'll get E minor 7, and we get A minor 7. So flat 7s on minor chords are super common. You see them all over the place. But we could just as easily add major 7 to a minor chord too. So we could take our D minor chord and we could add the major 7, just semitone down from our root note. D minor major 7. That's what the chord we've created. Now, minor major 7 chords aren't diatonic to the major scale, so we don't see them very often. However, they are diatonic to the melodic minor scale and the harmonic minor scale, so they do crop up on occasion. So as before, when we're adding a major 7 to a chord, we just simply add major 7 on the end. So when we're talking about it, we just say minor major 7, D minor major 7, G minor major 7, C major 7, and just add major 7 on the end. And then we can write that in a few different ways. But remember, we're not using that one. Don't do it. Okay, so why not just name the major 7 the 7? That makes more sense, right? I told you I'd come back to this. Now, I can certainly appreciate that thinking about chords like this can be the root of some confusion. Because if we think about adding notes in scale tones, then clearly the B here is the 7th degree of our scale. So surely adding a B to our C chord would make this a C7. That would be intuitive, but wrong. But this is a C7, even though actually it's not the 7, it's the flat 7. So I've been thinking about maybe why we don't call this a C7 when we're using a diatonic 7. And I reckon maybe it's probably something to do with what we would call this chord if this was a C7. By the way, little disclaimer, this bit is just my thoughts on why we call them what we do. My own little speculation. So this chord doesn't use our diatonic 7, it uses a flat 7, or the interval of a minor 7. But I think there's an obvious problem that if we were to start calling this a 7 and this a flat 7 chord, because think about it, E flat 7. Now is that E, an E chord with a flat 7, or is that an E flat chord with a 7? Or B flat 7? Is that a B chord with a 7 or a B flat chord with a 7? And the same thing happens if we think about it, if we call it a minor 7. We can't call that a C7 and that a C minor 7 because we have the same problem. Is that C minor with a 7 or is that a C with a minor 7? Or an E minor 7? Is that an E with a minor 7? Or is that an E minor with a 7? Okay, so that makes sense to me as to why we don't call dominant chords flat 7 or minor 7 chords. And I guess that maybe that's why it's easier just to call them 7th, but then it means that we can't call major 7ths 7ths either. Anyone else got any thoughts on this? Anyway, I guess also the confusion comes is because every other extension that we use, so whenever you use 6 or 9 or 11 or 13, when we refer to those numbers, we refer to those as being diatonic to our root note. They're not flattened. So it's just the 7th that ends up being this anomaly, this exception to the rule. But I think it's just something that you've got to learn. And once you've got it and grasped it, I think you're good to go. And also, there's another area of confusion within chord symbols and chord naming. If we look at C major 7 and C minor 7, then both of these have 3 elements to them. They have the chord, a letter, then they have the word major or minor, and then they have the 7 at the end. Now with C major 7, that word major in the middle is connected to the 7. It tells us what type of 7 it is. It gives us information regarding the 7. C minor 7, that word minor isn't connected to the 7, it's connected to the chord. It's telling us what type of chord it is. Now I've seen this being a possible area for confusion with some people, but it's just one of those conventions that you've got to learn, and it's not that tricky once you know what's what. It's not rocket surgery. Now there is another 7th chord that I've not talked about yet, and that's the diminished 7th. Now a diminished 7th chord doesn't quite fit into the same thinking that we've talked about already in this video, and that's because the diminished scale, which is where our diminished chord is birthed from, is an 8-note scale, unlike our major scale and minor scales, which are 7-note scales. So if we connect this back to what we did earlier with our major scale, and we created our 7ths within our major key. We did that by start on each note of the scale and missing a scale note. And then we did the same with our next root note. And we can do the same with our diminished scale. We could skip a note. And we have our diminished 7 chord. Now, all our other 7 chords, or C7 chords that we looked at, C7, C major 7, C minor 7, C minor major 7, all of those sevenths were either a B natural or a B flat. But C diminished, the 7th here, is an A natural. So this is a diminished 7, or sometimes called a double flattened 7th. So we've got our root note, then we've got our 7, our flat 7, our double flat 7. Diminished 7. And that's it, sevenths in a nutshell. Well, a generously sized nutshell. I hope it was useful for those of you who are a bit foggy on this topic. And a quick reminder that if you like what I'm doing here, like the stuff I'm putting on YouTube, then you can support me on Patreon. I really appreciate those who already are. You get a few extra bits of content for doing so. Thanks for being here.